Good morning from Washington and good evening from Jerusalem. Today is a very, very special day. It is the second Euroside of the passing of a great man, Bernard Lewis. Bernard has become a legend in death, and he was a legend in life. He was the author of over 1,000 articles and scores of books. And he represented the golden age of Middle Eastern studies when it was a rigorous discipline. And we felt on this occasion to mark the passing of a great man and to memorialize him a bit. I gathered together 3 people who knew him and worked with him the very best. Rhode, who actually got his PhD at Columbia University and worked in the Department of Defense for many, many years as a tremendous scholar of the Middle East, speaks Arabic, Farsi, many Turkish, many languages. Martin Kramer, who was the president of the Shalem College for 6 years, is a preeminent scholar and actually had written the seminal book on Middle Eastern studies that I refer to everyone, called Ivory Towers on Sand. He got his PhD under Dr. Bernard Lewis from Princeton University. And Buntzie Churchill, who has probably known him the best, he co-authored with Bernard Lewis. She co-authored 2 books and had edited scores and scores of his papers and other books. So without further ado, I am going to turn the program over to Harold. Harold, would you like to begin?
Well, thank you very much, Sarah. It's wonderful to be with Martin and Buntzie and you. It's a special day for Shavuot, and when Moses was supposedly born and died, and Bernard died just a few hours before the holiday. Bernard was for me both a mentor and sort of I want to say an adopted father. We spoke, probably from the mid-70s to maybe about at least 6 months right before he died, probably every day. What I learned from him about life and just, it was just unbelievable. When I was married, which of course was many years ago, he spoke for me at my wedding. My father had died long before, and here's how he described me. And I think it explains also our relationship. He said, for me, attended Columbia, but educated at Princeton. And that's true. And the reason is that he used to come to Princeton all the time, and we would walk and walk and walk and walk. He was unbelievable. And it's a deep personal loss, and a deep personal loss, really, for those who care about Middle East studies. And what he did for, besides the field, he was really the last great scholar that we had, but he also was deeply involved in government affairs. He met many presidents and was in the Oval Office, whatever, a whole bunch of times. And I'd like to give us 4 short thoughts then please, I'll turn it over to Martin, which I think gives an insight into who he was and how he thought on the future of the Muslim Middle East. He said the following, and he could do these pithy sentences, sum up everything. Regarding energy, he said, once we find an alternate source of energy besides the Middle East, he didn't mean windmills and stuff like that. He meant gas and oil and other places in the world. He said the Middle East, the way it's going, will probably retreat into insignificance, either on a par with Africa or worse. That's a terrible indictment. But Bernard was very much interested in truth, and he wasn't afraid to say it. On his Jewish identity, meant the world to him. I asked him once. I said, "Do you remember the first time that you set foot in the land of Israel?" He said, "Do I remember?" He said, "It was one of the most moving experiences of my life." I don't remember whether it was 1937, 38. I have this recorded somewhere because we did a lot of recorded conversations. Totally with his knowledge and consent. He said he came from either 1937, 38. He came via train from Egypt and crossed the border, and then was British mandated Palestine. He said, "I remember I can see the very first step that I took onto the land of Israel." And deeply meaning, deeply moving to him. On the future of Middle Eastern studies, I think probably one of the best ways of saying it, he himself expected of all of his students and those that he loved who worked on the Middle East, we had to put in hours and hours and hours of study. I think it was the author, Malcolm Gladwell, who talked about putting in 10,000 hours, steeping yourselves, in this case, in the languages, in the cultures, traveling around the area, living the lives of people from that part of the world, so you could imbibe, so you could imbibe yourself, so you could understand them emotionally, who and what they were. And what is interesting is that the reason that really Middle Eastern studies has collapsed, and Martin, from what I understand, will address this, really one of the major reasons of his collapse is a professor of English literature by the name of Edward Saidian. And he, who was not a Muslim, and one could even argue he wasn't born in British Palestine, or he was born in British Palestine and grew up in Cairo. He was a Christian. He was a Protestant. He said that unless you are from a particular culture, you'll never succeed in understanding it. One could make that argument that since he isn't a Muslim, or wasn't, he's dead, that he could have therefore never understand it. But leave that as it may. But what does that mean? What are the ramifications of that? And Bernard and I talked about this at length. It's an excuse for laziness. If you can never understand the culture, if there's no way, whatever you do, no matter how much time you put into it, why even try? And the result is you have these people who have PhDs, advanced degrees, whatever, in the Middle East, who don't know the languages, don't know the culture, who usually they hate the West, they hate Western society. Bernard loved Western culture, and they don't know anything about it. And the result is the scholarship has plummeted. And maybe I'll just end with one thing. I worked for 28 years at the Pentagon, and during the Kuwait War, the Pentagon invited 58 so-called expert scholars of the Middle East. Well, what was going to happen if we, or when we, or if we would ever went into, if we took Kuwait from Saddam? 56 of the 58 said the Muslim world, the Arab world would be embroiled, Americans would be unsafe, and on and on and on. Two said something different. Two very good friends who I know loved each other very much. One was Fuad Ajami, the late Fuad Ajami, who had the guts, after being an Arab nationalist in his youth, to realize that Arab nationalism was really another form of Sunni, attempt of Sunni dominance. Fuad was a Shiite, and he re-examined it, and to one of his closest friends in the world, the other one, and that's Bernard Lewis. Of course, both of them disagreed strongly with that. So may I just say that during the war, right before the war, before America went into Iraq, the Pentagon invited some scholars to talk about this. This time they invited two scholars, the ones who knew it so well, who loved it so much, and who were right before, and they would be right now if they were both alive. They'd get it. That is Fuad Ajami and our beloved Professor Bernard Lewis. May his soul rest, be bound among the souls of the living. I have no doubt that in some way he is participating in this little talk. You should know, Bernard, that the three people that are talking today love, admire, respect you very much, and you are sorely, sorely missed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harold. Martin, I neglected to say that aside from his wonderful scholarship, Martin Kramer also is the chair of the Department of Middle Eastern Studies at Shalem College, which is a phenomenal university or college in Jerusalem, Israel. Martin, I'm sure you have many words to say.
Thank you, Sarah, for the invitation to speak today about Bernard. And I'm delighted to join Harold and Buntzie. They were lights in Bernard's life. I had a more limited role as his student and disciple. So it's from that perspective that I'll make a few remarks on what made him unique and on his view of Middle Eastern studies in particular. I'm going to share my screen so you can see a few things that I want to show in the course of these remarks. Okay. There, by the way, is Bernard with Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, one of the things I check from time to time is fresh references to Bernard. And amazingly, not a day goes by when someone doesn't mention him. It can be a scholarly article or a newspaper item or a post on social media. On Twitter, on some days, not an hour goes by without his name cropping up. I checked today, in the past 24 hours, there were 15 references to Bernard that had nothing to do with this event, by the way. People quote him or misquote him. They take photos of passages in his books and they post them. They praise him, they attack him. The Turks, by the way, do this obsessively. And sometimes it's as if Bernard were still among us. Now, what does this tell us? I think it tells us two things. First, no one has filled his shoes, not as a scholar and not as a public intellectual. And while there are obviously competent scholars here and there, Bernard had a gift. It was a gift for translating the insights of scholarship to laymen. He wrote well, he came across well on the screen, and his crisp English accent spoke authority. Only two Middle East scholars ever pulled off the public role in America. Bernard was one, and as mentioned by Harold, the other was his close friend, Fuad Ajami. You just weren't up to date if you hadn't read both of them in the Wall Street Journal or Foreign Affairs or seen them on a major interview show. Now, the stage that Bernard and Fuad once filled is now empty. Ask any reasonably informed American for the name of an expert on the Middle East or Islam, and he'll draw a blank. Now, there may be more of these experts today than ever before, but more has become less. Second, the issues he analyzed are still relevant. Bernard knew how to identify emerging issues before anyone else and put them in their precise contexts. Now, one context obviously was historical. Bernard was a historian by discipline, whether it was the Iranian Revolution or bin Laden. Bernard showed how the churning history of Islam hurled them onto the front page of the newspaper on our doorstep. But other times the context was semantic, and I think that needs more attention. Bernard was a concert pianist with words. He had a complete and utter mastery of the full range of the English language, Bernard never wasted words. He never stumbled over words. He never misused words. Yes, of course, he taught us the deeper meaning of words in Arabic and Persian, and Turkish and Hebrew, but he also taught us the deeper meaning of words in English. He was an Englishman and also an English man. Now, if an English word came into the public sphere, he saw it as the scholar's first duty to define it accurately. And today, we're barraged, with sloppy use and abuse of terms such as genocide and apartheid and Islamophobia and so on. Bernard would latch onto a contentious term, uncover its origins, and track its evolutions. And then he would define it for present use, always with exact precision. Now, let me give an example that may speak to this audience. Bernard's definition of anti-Semitism. After he came to America, Bernard felt freer to write about Jewish affairs and not just about Islam. He wrote a book, many of you may be familiar with it, Semites and Anti-Semites, and there were articles on the new anti-Semitism in the New York Review and the American Scholar. And there he showed how anti-Semitism had evolved so as to survive the Holocaust. It first originated in religious prejudice. It then became a murderous kind of racial doctrine, and it reemerged as an obsessive hatred of the state of Israel. But here, it's worth noting that Bernard showed great caution lest anti-Semitism be defined too broadly. So let me quote him, because of course no one expresses Bernard's ideas better than Bernard. And here's the quote I'll bring. There is a well-worn platitude that we have all heard many times before. It is perfectly legitimate to criticize the actions and policies of the state of Israel or the doctrines of Zionism without necessarily being motivated by anti-Semitism. The fact that this has been repeated ad nauseum does not detract from its truth. Not only do I accept it, but I would even take it a step further with another formulation that may perhaps evoke surprise, if not shock. Bernard has told us he's going to shock us. Well, that's interesting. Let's watch him in this clip deliberately evoke that surprise and shock from an Israeli audience. This was at the Hebrew University.
Final point which I wanted to discuss briefly. I think we have to be careful in using the word anti-Semitism or anti-Semite to understand precisely what we're talking about. I will say something which may strike you as absurd, but if you will think for a moment, I think you'll agree that it makes sense. It is perfectly possible to hate Jews, even to persecute Jews, without being anti-Semitic. That strikes you as nonsense. It isn't. What I mean is this: hating people who are different, persecuting people who are different, even on occasion massacring people who are different, is part of the normal human condition. We find it all through history. We find it in every part of the world, in every civilization. Anti-Semitism is distinct in that it attributes to the victim, to the Jews, a kind of quality of cosmic evil, the like of which cannot, as far as I am aware, be found anywhere else.
Now this is quintessential Bernard. And this one clip deserves an essay. The way he sets up his audience, right? The way he surprises it, the way he disarms it. But style aside, and in summary, he says this: anti-Semitism is attributing cosmic evil to the Jews and nothing less than that. All right. So Bernard here isn't repeating the old adage that an anti-Semite is someone who dislikes Jews more than is necessary. Right? It's not the quantity of his hatred that makes an anti-Semite, but its quality. So anti-Semitism isn't just a conventional prejudice. It's not even the conventional prejudice against Jews, which survives in lots of places. As he said, it's distinct, it's unique, as is the Holocaust it produced. Now you might disagree with Bernard. I think it can also be argued that conventional prejudice against Jews create space for the full-blown anti-Semites around us. But that doesn't negate Bernard's distinction between prejudice against Jews and anti-Semitism. Bernard believed loaded terms should be defined with precision on the basis of a logical distinction. Definition is distinction. A definition shouldn't wander, and it should exclude more than it includes. Now, for Bernard, precision in language was a matter of standards. And that brings me to Bernard and Middle Eastern studies. Now, there have been many criticisms of Middle Eastern studies over the years. As Sarah mentioned, I made one in my book, Ivory Towers on Sand. There are others. Most of these have focused on exposing bias, ideological and political, a bias which is endemic in the field. But Bernard made a different criticism, and it was one only he could make credible. He held that Middle Eastern studies didn't uphold the basic standards accepted in other academic fields. And I quote him from 1979 in his article, The State of Middle Eastern Studies. It is painful for a Middle East specialist to admit the fact, but it is nevertheless inescapable. Professional advancement in Middle Eastern studies can be achieved with knowledge and skills well below what is normally required in other more developed fields or more frequented disciplines where standards are established and maintained by a large number of competent professionals over long periods. This has led to low standards of entry at the student level that continue to the professorial level, to low standards of performance, and to low standards of promotion in academic institutions. Now, how many scholars do you know who've taken their own field to task with such brutal honesty? Coming from Bernard, who was the keeper of the highest standards, this critique was absolutely devastating. And it left him a lonely man. I mean, obviously he was disliked by the followers of Edward Said, but he was shunned by the others too, because he questioned their competence and professionalism. And for this refusal to compromise standards, he paid a price. But Bernard was secure enough in his knowledge, strong enough in his convictions, never to compromise standards. Would his limiting definition of anti-Semitism shock his co-religionists? So be it. Would his own critique of Middle Eastern studies alienate his fellow scholars? Couldn't be helped. Bernard insisted on rigor in language and scholarship, no more so than in the Jewish community and the professional guild to which he himself belonged. Now, who does that today? Who does that today with Bernard's authority or style? No one. And that's why we miss him. But that's why people keep quoting him and citing him and arguing with him, even though he rests in a corner of Trumpeldor Cemetery. Now, Bernard, by setting and upholding the highest standards, achieved a measure of immortality. Bernard remains our champion, but he also remains our critic. He held not only those people to high standards, but he holds us to them as well. So let such memorials remind us that we too must raise our standards. When we write, when we speak, let's ask ourselves, what would Bernard think? What must we do to live up to him? There's no better way to honor his memory and to sustain his legacy. Back to you, Sarah.
Yes, and the part of this presentation that I personally am most anxious to hear is from Buntzie Churchill. And again, I'm sorry I neglected to say, aside from the wonderful relationship that she shared with Bernard Lewis over decades, Buntzie was the president of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia for over 2 decades. And without further ado, I'd like Buntzie to unmask the man behind the myth and the legend. Thank you, Buntzie. Oh, Buntzie, unmute your mic. Let's see if you can.
How about that? Are we on?
Okay, perfect, okay.
I was very fortunate, I think, when I met Bernard, which was probably 25, 28 years ago, because when I met him, I didn't know who he was. So therefore, I wasn't genuflecting and bowing as everybody else was. I was just sort of myself. And we were a couple for 22 years. And you can imagine that my favorite line in his memoir is, "Who would expect at the age of 80 to fall in love?" Well, I was honored, flattered, and delighted to be the lady in his life. And I want to share with you really some of my reminiscences of Bernard. And he was such a charming English gentleman. He was always a gentleman. And he was, as Martin has so ably said, he was the master of 4 civilizations: Western, Classical, Islamic, and Jewish. And for 60 years, hopefully continuing, he was the preeminent historian of the Middle East. His books have been translated into 29 languages. He wrote 32 books, hundreds and hundreds of articles on the Middle East, Islam, Jewry, and general history, and they have shaped generations of scholars. He was also the master of 15 languages. His English was flawless, as Martin has described, and he was fluent in French, German, Italian, Danish, Turkish, Arabic, Persian, and Yiddish. And he could manage Norwegian, Russian, and Spanish, and don't forget Greek and Latin. He insisted on understanding foreigners in their own languages and always understood that our frame of reference, our identities, the superstructure of our thought hinge on words and they radiate within us. I want to tell you some amusing stories, but Martin reminded me of, in terms of Bernard's succinctness, he described what was going on today in one perfect sentence. Islam has an immunity from criticism that Christianity has lost and Judaism never had. That's where we are. Well, Bernard and I would talk about some odd things every once in a while, and we were once comparing or discussing the female of the species and the different animal species. So you have the cow and the bull, the fox and the vixen, the rooster and the hen. And I said, "What's the female of rabbit?" And he said, "Rebbitzin." We one time got into a conversation about heraldic emblems and talking about what different countries had in their shields. And so England, you have the lion in its heraldry, Russia, the bear, Welsh, the dragon, the US has the eagle. And I said, what would be the Middle East in its heraldic? He said, the sandfly. One time talking about the technology industry, and we were talking about Russia, and he referred to them as the dot-commies. Anyway, Martin mentioned when Saddam went into Kuwait. I think my favorite punchline of Bernard's was Saddam went into Kuwait in 1990, and in January of 91, the US led a coalition of 39 countries to go in after Saddam and to liberate Kuwait. And they did this in a 100-hour ground campaign. And when Bernard heard that, he said, 100 hours? They shouldn't have called it the Gulf War. They should have called it Kuwaitis Interruptus. He was basically incomparable. The Wall Street Journal called him the world's foremost Islamic scholar. The New York Times, the doyen of Middle East studies. Al-Aram in Cairo said, Bernard Lewis has no living rival in his field. But Bernard himself particularly liked that a 1965 Arab translation of the Middle East and the West was published under the auspices of the Muslim Brothers. And the translator's introduction included the comment, "It's clear the author is one of two things, either a candid friend or an honorable enemy. And in either case, he is one who disdains to distort the truth." It's interesting that a book published under the auspices of the Muslim Brothers was at the same time translated and published under the auspices of the Israel Defense Forces. Bernard loved poetry, and one of his really books to treasure is Music of a Distant Drum, where he published his translations of medieval poems from the Turkish, Persian, Arabic, and Hebrew. And I have to tell you that one of my favorites is by Yehuda Halevi, the 11th century Hebrew poet, who said, "One gray hair appeared on my head. I plucked it out with my hand. It answered me, 'You have prevailed against me alone. What will you do when my army comes after me?'" Another, because this is a holiday, I remember once driving to Bernard's home in Princeton, and when he opened, it was right before some holiday, and when he opened the door, I said, "Hag Sameach," and he immediately said, "No, Hug Sameach," and he put much preferable. On his headstone at the Trumpeldor Cemetery, it describes him as scholar, sage, mensch, beloved. It's a perfect description of the man. But one wonders sometimes, what did Bernard think of himself? And the classic to that is, we were walking along Ben Yehuda Street in Tel Aviv, and an elderly man comes running up to Bernard and says, "Are you the great Bernard Lewis?" And Bernard thought for a moment or two and said, "Sometimes." He was thrilled to know that he would never leave the land of Israel. And so there he rests while we just miss him.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Buntzie. Buntzie, bravo to all of you, to each one of you. I'd like to ask, first of all, Buntzie, could you tell this somewhat famous quote of what Bernard Lewis said about the Edward Saidian revolution, that one has got to be an Arab in order to actually know the Middle East? Oops, let's unmute you again. Can you unmute your mic?
I am unmuted. Am I
okay,
unmuted?
perfect. Okay, right, perfect.
Bernard, in his memoir, describes it as, Said said that if you're not an Arab, you really can't understand Islam or Arabic culture. Bernard described it in his book as if you will get a view of history of Sweden if it's given to you by a Swede. A non-Swede gives you a different perspective that is equally valuable. But Bernard was giving a lecture at UCLA, and this story has slightly different variations, but mine is the best. Okay. So a student got up and said, "How can you, a Jew from England, possibly understand Islam and Islamic culture?" And Bernard, in his very gentlemanly, quiet way, he never got angry. He said, "Well, this university has a world-renowned department of oceanography, and I have to assume it's not manned by a faculty of fish."
Bravo, bravo. Have any of you attended the Middle Eastern Studies Association gatherings recently? And if not, why? Would you like to talk a little bit about what's happened to the entire discipline or lack thereof of Middle Eastern studies? Harold?
And there's nothing to learn there. You can learn how to hate. Unfortunately, there are very, very few people. You go there, and the older you get, and I'm now 70, I say to myself, time matters to me more than anything. If I'm going to do something, I want to know that I'm a better person, that I come out with new ideas to think about. It's not worth it. The people that go there are just angry. It's not worth it. ASME, on the other hand, the Middle East Association that both Bernard and Fuad Ajami founded, there are people that are interesting. There are people that ask good questions. Certainly, if there is a future, it's going to be from those people.
Martin, no one is a better critic of the Middle Eastern Studies Association than you. And as I say, you wrote this seminal book about this. So what is your feeling about the current state of affairs of Middle Eastern studies?
First, as far as the Middle East Studies Association, about 4 or 5 years ago, I did go. It was in Washington, and I took an anthropological interest in what was going on there. I registered, I refused to join the association as a matter of principle, and it had to do with Bernard, actually. The Middle East Study Association had a category of 10 distinguished scholars who had honorary membership or honorary standing in the association, and they could never see their way to electing Bernard. Even if Bernard had stopped producing anything at the age of 50, he would have warranted this distinction. But for political reasons, they couldn't do it. And I said, if it's a political association, then I won't be a member of it. But I was interested in going just to see, since it was in Washington and I was in Washington, what the state of affairs is, because people often come to me and ask the question you ask. So obviously, if an anthropologist hasn't visited that tribe, how can he describe what goes on in the tribe? You have to go and see for yourself. And I saw something interesting. There is, in this large association, 3,000 people, there are serious scholars doing serious work. But overlaying them is this mass of activists and polemicists and agenda pushers. And they have essentially hijacked the public face of this organization, the committees of the organization, the plenary, the decision-making in this organization. So actually, you could go to the Middle East Studies Association and go from panel to panel in areas of your specific interest, things that interested Bernard, like Ottoman history or medieval Islamic studies, and come away and learn something. But the minute you stepped into a plenum or into one of these committees, then the politics would pour out. And the problem was the silence and the timidity of the good people. That's what's wrong in Middle Eastern studies. It's not all black, but the light that's there has been smothered by these other people. And I think that's true for the field as a whole. And that was what Bernard had. He was prepared to speak up. There were other people in the field who knew exactly what Bernard said in that quote that I brought, that the standards were low, right? Performance was low. The requirements of appointments were low. They knew it, but they wouldn't speak it because they'd been intimidated into silence. Maybe it was because Bernard was Bernard. Maybe it was because he was the Cleveland Dodge Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at Princeton and member of the Institute for Advanced Study. He didn't feel the same, that he operated under the same constraints. So he spoke truth, as they like to say in the expression, truth to power, in this case, in Middle Eastern Studies. As far as the state of the field today, if that's your question, it's still under this cloud.
Right. Because of the work that we are constantly doing, where I first met you, Martin, when we were working together to try to make some reforms in Title VI of the Higher Education Act. Over the years, I've heard horror stories from students. It's impossible to step foot into the classroom in most Middle Eastern studies programs or departments throughout this country without buying into the premise that Israel was born in the original sin of displacing the Palestinian population. And for students that try to challenge this, unfortunately, the power structure is so one-sided. Many of them have gotten penalized in their grades. So what we're seeing is the replacement of discipline and scholarship by pure propaganda, which is a shame. That's number one. Number two, what you see is how Edward Said has his disciples, Rashid Khalidi, Joseph Massad, Khatam Bazian, and it takes on the patina of scholarship because they all quote and footnote one another. So it's very, very difficult for one to try to survive any of these classes with any kind of sense of honesty to oneself, particularly if you're a Jew or a Christian Zionist in any of these classes. It's horrific. Now we have some questions that have come.
Sarah, if you don't mind, just one story that happened to Bernard along these lines. Bernard had a very good friend, an Algerian, Muslim, who lived in Paris. Friend, and they agreed basically about the world. They were both on a panel in Paris. And Bernard knew exactly what this guy thought. about the topic they were discussing, which was what Bernard thought. Bernard spoke, and this guy got and he passionately attacked Bernard publicly, his friend. And he went on and on to, quote, prove how Bernard was wrong. Bernard sat there in shock. Afterwards, Bernard asked him, why did you say this? You know you don't believe this. I know you don't. He said, you're right. He said, but you're a Jew. If you say these things, nothing will happen to you. If I say them, I could be murdered. That's the state so much of Middle Eastern studies today, especially if you're a Muslim and you don't have the I hate the West view of the world.
Right. Okay, some questions have come in that I could read. Since Bernard Lewis's death, has the world altered its view of the dynamic in the Middle East? Has anyone arisen with a valid alternative view to his? And how persevering will Lewis's ideas remain in your considered opinions? 3 questions there.
I'll take a shot at it. Bernard's major contribution in the period after he came to the United States was to anticipate the rise of extreme radical forms of Islam. He wrote that famous article, The Return of Islam, in 1976. Remember, this is before the Iranian Revolution. Everybody dismissed it. They said, oh, no, he's just making this stuff up. And then comes the Iranian Revolution and the Islamic movements arise all through the Arab world. And the next thing you know, we have this wave. He, in 1998, writes in the Foreign Affairs an article analyzing one of bin Laden's edicts, saying this man has declared global jihad against the West. No one took it seriously. And in 2001, what happened, happened. So Bernard was the man who told us again and again, a prophet warning that this was going to be the face of the Middle East to come. Since he's died, what happened? We had ISIS, right? Everyone admits in the Guild that they didn't anticipate ISIS. Had they been reading Bernard and taking Bernard seriously, they would have understood that something like ISIS would inevitably come along in the Arab world. And I don't think we're through it yet. So I would say that the Middle East continues much more to conform to Bernard's vision than to the vision of his critics. And I just add one thing here. In his very last years after the Iraq War and so forth, Bernard began to talk about democracy in the Middle East. That things were shifting, that people were no longer prepared to live under the kind of authoritarian rule that they had suffered under previously, as in the case of Iraq, where he thought that this would have some effect on the Arab world more widely. Well, it was a delayed effect. We did get the Arab Spring in the end. It turned out to be abortive, but no one else saw it coming. And there's one article that Bernard published in Foreign Affairs, which I think comes the closest to a prophecy that something like the Arab Spring is coming. Now, he's been off the public stage really for almost a decade now. So it's hard to look at his early writings and say, this is telling us where the Middle East is going to be a decade going forward from here. But I think the salience of Islam and the underlying desire of people to be free, where there's 2 messages, and they continue to resonate, and we'll continue to see them manifest themselves in the politics of the Middle East.
This is a wonderful question that just came in, and it's a bit more difficult. Looking back, how do you all assess Bernard's optimism about democracy as a principle in Iraq and the Middle East?
Well, I could
Harold take a shot
at that first, because he was with him in the policy halls in Washington, and then I'll say something.
Okay.
This, shall we say, in this particular instance, and we could add to that also the Oslo process, which in the beginning Bernard supported, is the triumph of hope over reason. Bernard wanted so much to at least have a chance to join the community of nations, if there is such a thing, and be honored and respected and all that. Deep respect for Islamic history and culture. But he sometimes, I know I'm myself, I'm guilty of this. Sometimes I want something to be, and therefore I I see it. Let me tell you a little story about Oslo that maybe gives some insight into this question in general. Bernard supported Oslo in the beginning. Remember when he was born? He was born in 1916. He lived in England and elsewhere during the Holocaust. Wasn't aware of it. We only really knew afterwards, he said. And Bernard knew that most of the students that he loved and admired, respected the most were opposed to Oslo in some form. We really never talked about it, but he knew I was. We talked intellectually about it, but why and all that. Anyway, as Oslo was failing, I remember he was speaking once at the Senate. And then he and I walked back to Union Station, the train station in Washington. He was going back to Princeton. And I said to him the following. I said, Bernard, I'm sure you realize that most of the students that you admire, respect, have mentored, whatever, have opposed Oslo all along. He said, that has not gone unnoticed. But did you ever think possibly that it was because of you that we opposed it? He said, tell me more. I said, you grew up in the period when you saw Hitler's Germany, you saw the extermination of the Jews. You were desperate that this not happen again. And maybe did you possibly hope differently, things would come out differently? I said, most of your students, I was born in 1949 after the war. I said, most of your students didn't have that personal experience of living and seeing what happened during the Holocaust. And when you told us Muslims in territory that Muslims conquer, that Islam must rule, and non-Muslims who have a prior revelation from God, meaning basically Muslims and whether they're Jews and Christians, that we have a right to live under Islam, but basically as dhimmis, as in political and social inferiority. And as a result, since Muslims can't give up on any territory which was Islamic, and for that matter, Tel Aviv, it's the same by that definition of anywhere in Judea or Samaria, because they were conquered by the Muslims in 637, 38, and therefore must remain so. And Bernard said, he said he hadn't really thought about it, but it made sense. Bernard is guilty, as he's a normal human being, of wanting something to be the way it was. So therefore, democracy, maybe, whether we like it or not, unless there is a radical reinterpretation of Islam, maybe it's impossible to have Western democracy in the Middle East, in the Muslim world.
One of my favorite quotes is by Margaret Thatcher when she said, "We in the West make a great mistake when we transpose our values into the rest of the world." And it's a very, very human thing to do. It's projection. Martin, I know you wanted to speak up to this.
This interest of Bernard in the spread of democracy in the Islamic world goes back to his early years. He writes that in 1950, he was in Turkey where there was a free election which overturned Kemalist rule. And it was bliss to be alive, he wrote. And you can understand why he felt that way. Remember, we didn't live through the Second World War. We didn't live in a world which was dominated by totalitarian states. Nazi Germany sweeping through Europe. Bernard lived through that. He was in a struggle to defend democracy and freedom. First in the Second World War and then in the Cold War. He was a patriot, he called a patriot of civilization. It's a phrase he used for von Grunebaum, but I think it applies to him. And obviously he wanted to see it spread. And look, if you'd lived through that and saw the rise and fall of Nazi Germany, and then Germany evolve as it did, the same with Japan, to see democracy spread from a small group of states, which it was in his youth, to encompass the greater part of the world, you would also think and hope that the part of the world that you had studied would also succumb to the charms of democracy. So it hasn't happened. It didn't happen. It certainly wasn't going to happen as a result of the Iraq War. But it's impossible to deny that there are seeds that have been planted. Right? And the question is, under what circumstances will they sprout? Bernard thought they would sprout in his lifetime. They didn't. I don't know that they'll sprout in my lifetime or in the lifetimes of anyone who's on this call. But I don't think we should sit here and say it can never happen. Bernard was insistent that Muslims and Arabs are people like all other peoples, that they have some of the same desires that we all have, and that eventually it'll manifest itself. So, of course, in history and in politics, timing is everything. Here, the timing was badly off. But I wouldn't sit here and say, and Bernard, I think if he were here, wouldn't sit here and say that they are doomed forever to regimes of intolerance and dictatorship. And in fact, if you go in his writings, he said the opposite.
And now the final question that's come in is, we'll never have another Bernard Lewis. But for those of us who treasure his scholarship, who would you recommend as the upcoming scholars and works to follow and to read? I particularly like to read Martin Kramer, and I want to recommend his blog site, Sandbox. But aside from Martin Kramer, present company accepted, who else would you recommend? Buntzie.
Well, I underline your comment about Martin Kramer. Martin is so clear. It's one of the great things about being a non-Middle East expert to be able to read Martin that way. But I would suggest going back and reading some of Bernard's books. Some of them are as prescient today as they were back then. They're as clear, and they're very much worth taking a second and third and fourth look at.
I would second that. I teach a course at Shalem College every year on Bernard Lewis. It's a course for the most advanced students. And what it is basically a reading course. Fortunately, much of his work has already been translated into Hebrew as well, so it's easily accessible to students, although obviously I prefer them to read the English original when they can. And the students, when they encounter Bernard as undergraduates, are just astonished because they've been reading other things until they get to the last year of their studies. And very little of it actually inspires a desire for emulation. But when they read Bernard's style and his approach and his analytical method, it sweeps them off their feet. Now, obviously, some of the books have stood the test of time better than others. Bernard was the first to say this. He said, for example, that his book, The Emergence of Modern Turkey, would be superseded. He himself said it. It was a monograph. Other monographs will come along and replace it. But then there were certain books that he wrote that only he could write. And the best example of that was The Muslim Discovery of Europe, because only he knew as much Islamic history and European history to have combined them and to have written such a book. So I think that there's a lot there that repays rereading. And I would also recommend that, generally speaking, the work of his students, and there were many. I'm just one. Thank you for the compliment, Buntzie. But as you know, he had many, many students over the years. The ones he had in England are long retired and aren't producing anymore. But the ones he had in Princeton still are there and are writing. So, there's a chain of transmission here. Not all of them shared Bernard's views. There's no question about that. But all of them learned something of his style and his method. And reading the students of Bernard Lewis is always, I find, rewarding.
The other thing to note is that his students most of his students, I don't know as many as you do, but they seem to love him. And he was revered by his students. I mean, I get notes periodically, or the ones that they wrote to me, hundreds on the occasion of his death, were quite extraordinary in their feeling of him as a scholar, as a mensch, as a mentor. It was quite extraordinary.
Yes, as a teacher, he took a profound interest in his students. His was not a superficial guidance when he was your PhD supervisor, not at all. He read at length. He would invite you up to the Institute for Advanced Study. You would go for a walk in the woods. He would go shelf by shelf through his library, telling you the lore of who had said and written and done what. I mean, it was an education in and of itself, and that explains the affection that the students had for him.
We should note that his 18,000 volume library in 10 or more languages is reposing at the Tel Aviv University Library, and they have it together. So you can go and browse through the Bernard Lewis Library.
Right. If you were to recommend one book by all the tomes that Bernard had written, which one would you recommend?
Could I wouldn't recommend a book. I'd recommend the article that Martin mentioned. It completely changed my life. The Return of Islam, written in 1976. The message is quite simple. Don't use our values and our way of looking at the world in the West to try to understand the Islamic world. He analyzes the PLO at the time. He analyzes Egypt, a few other places. And once I remember that, I had studied by 1976, I'd been in Middle East studies since 1966. And I knew a lot of facts and I could ace any test. I didn't understand the Middle East, there's no question. That article completely said to me, it's as if Bernard was looking and said, dummy, and Bernard would never say that to anybody. It's not your problem of your abilities. It's that you must use a Middle Eastern framework to understand them. From then on, I think I've done an okay job, and I owe that entirely to Bernard. So that article that Martin mentioned, The Return of Islam, it's the best thing for someone who's not going to spend years and hours whenever, because it says, how do you do it?
Okay, well, on that note, Martin, did you want to add?
I'll just add very quickly. If you're looking for a short book, which I think encapsulates Bernard's approach, there's a short book called History, Remembered, Recovered, Invented. This book is out of print, but if you can find it, buy a copy. It's short. It was originally a series of lectures, and there's a lot of Jewish interest in this book too. If you want to know what Bernard thought about Masada, history and myth, go there. And his comparison to that with Persepolis and the Iranian approach to Persepolis, worth the price of admission. Because here you saw someone who had stepped back from his professional writing on specific topics and decided to look at the broad picture. How much of history do we remember? How much of it is recovered through archaeology? How much of it is just invented? Here with Bernard at his fort, really played to all his strengths. So, and you can read it in a pleasurable 2 or 3 hours. Give it a try.
Wonderful. Now it's time for us to come to a close. I just want to say thank you to all of our wonderful, wonderful speakers today. Bernard Lewis's legacy will live long after any one of us are gone. He's gone, but he will never, ever be forgotten. Thank you so much.
Good.
And
thank you, Sarah.